Hey there, Slashaholics. Please don't skip ahead yet. I just need a moment of your time. Just want to let you know we cannot monetize the channel here on YouTube, so we depend on you Slashaholics to keep this channel funded so it can keep going and growing for years to come. To do so, you can hit the description below or the pinned comment and join our Patreon. You can also donate through PayPal or Cash App or even order a Cameo video from us. All the information to do these things is in the description and the pinned comment, and we would greatly appreciate it. It is the only way that we can keep this channel going. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy tonight's narration. Child's Play, the novelization by Jeremy Terry. Chapter 15, Andy at County General. The elevator rumbled to a halt with a loud squill of gears in much need of attention, and the doors trundled open to reveal a long corridor painted a hideously institutional shade of baby puke green. Andy hesitated, listening to the muttering hum and babble of the insane. He took a breath and grimaced at the astringent hospital odor of bleach and urine. This was a terrible place. He glanced up at the tall older man standing beside him, sure that a mistake had been made. He wasn't supposed to be there where little boys and girls howled like animals or stared blankly off into the middle distance where scenes only they could see played out endlessly. Dr. Ardmore smiled down at Andy and put a gentle hand in the center of his back to move him forward. There had been no mistake. This madhouse was to be Andy's new home. Fear and crushing loneliness settled on his little shoulders, threatening to bring him to his knees. He clutched his small suitcase to his chest and stepped out. A huge orderly met them at the door, a clipboard in his hairy, knuckled hands. The man did not even glance down at Andy. He was not a friend. Dr. Ardmore exchanged a few words with the man, and the man nodded, turning to place a key in the elevator panel to the right of the doors. They slid shut with an electric buzz, and a light changed from green to red on the panel. The door was locked tight. There would be no escape that way. "Come along, Andy," Ardmore said. A large, fake smile spread across his pale lips. He wanted Andy to see him as a friend, but Andy could see the truth behind the smile and cold, clinical eyes. He didn't really care about Andy at all.
"Where are we going?"
Andy asked, his voice trembling. "I'm going to show you to your room," Ardmore replied. "I'll let you get settled in for a bit, and then you and I will have a chat to get to know each other better. How's that sound?" Like doo-doo, Andy thought, but did not say. He knew what the doctor wanted, so he forced a smile and said that sounded good to him. "Excellent," Ardmore said, prodding Andy deeper into the corridor. Andy walked in silence beside the man, staring wide-eyed at the kids in their white gowns and shorts. They ranged from younger than Andy himself all the way to teenagers. Each face wore the same slightly confused expression, as if the world around them were just out of reach and they didn't know how to touch it. They passed an open door on the left side of the hall, and Andy looked in. It was a rec room of sorts. More kids sat listlessly around the room, staring off into the void or at white static on the TV screen. One blonde girl sat muttering to herself at a table in front of an unfinished puzzle. Suddenly she frowned and leaned forward, hanging her forehead down on the tabletop, sending puzzle pieces flying. Andy and the doctor passed on. They came to another door where a small boy about Andy's age was wrestling with two orderlies who were attempting to stuff him into a straitjacket. Would they do that to him? What was he supposed to do if he had an itch on his nose? Andy thought that having an itch that you couldn't scratch would drive him crazier than the doctor already thought he was. "Here we are," Ardmore said as they came abreast of another open door. "This is where you'll be staying, Andy. I hope you like it." Of course I won't, Andy thought, as he walked through the open door and looked around. The room was smaller than his room at home and painted the same horrible shade of green as the corridor outside. There was a sink and a metal toilet on one wall, and a single bed and desk on the opposite wall. Andy crossed the room to the sole window and peered out between the bars on an external stairwell that wound up the corner of the hospital. Another building beyond rose up beyond that, forming a small square between. A gray morning sky hung over it all, melancholy as the little boy's mood. "Nice, isn't it?" Ardmore asked as he stepped into the room behind Andy. "Of course, I'm sure it will be even better once your mother brings you some of your own things from home." Andy shrugged and walked towards the bed where he froze when he saw a familiar tuft of red hair sticking up from the floor between the bed frame and the desk. The doctor had been waiting for this reaction and asked Andy what was wrong. Andy pointed silently at the good guy doll seated on the floor. Ardmore walked over and picked the doll up in one hand. "Yes, that's right. It's Chucky. But see, he's only a doll." Ardmore flung his arm out, throwing the doll against the concrete wall. It struck hard and bounced off, coming to rest at the doctor's feet. Ardmore bent to pick it up and then showed it to Andy. "Did you see that? Do you think Chucky would have let me do that to him if he were alive?" Andy shook his head.
That's not Chucky.
Ardmore frowned. "Of course it is. Look at him."
He just looks like Chucky.
Ardmore stared at Andy for a moment and then shrugged. "All right, you win. That isn't Chucky. But Chucky is a doll just like this one. Chucky is dead just like this one."
No, he isn't.
Andy said, shaking his head.
Chucky's alive, and he's going to come here and get me.
Ardmore put a comforting hand on Andy's shoulder. "Don't be silly, Andy. Chucky isn't coming for you. He can't. He's a doll. Besides, he couldn't get into the building even if he were alive." Andy turned his back on the doctor and the doll and walked back over to the window.
He'll find a way. I know him. He'll find a way to come here and try to kill me.
"You don't have to worry about that," Ardmore said. "I'm here and I'll protect you. I promise. Now why don't you try to get some rest, huh? You had a very long night and I know you didn't sleep much." Ardmore didn't wait for a reply. Andy listened to his footsteps recede as he left the room with the doll and shut the door behind him. Andy heard the sharp clack as the doctor locked the door behind him. "You won't be able to stop him," Andy said to the now empty room. "No one will. He's going to come here to kill me." Andy gripped the cold metal bars as tears began to fall. He wanted his mommy and the nice policeman that had kept him company after Aunt Maggie fell out the window. The policeman could save him from Chucky. Then Mommy could take him away from the hospital and they could be happy again. If only they were there. If only. Chapter 16. Pieces fall into place. The dimly lit corridor was redolent with the stench of mildew, mold, and the fetid odor of the sweaty fat man walking beside her. The tag on his shirt said his name was Edward, the building superintendent. Looking around at the graffiti-covered walls and mounds of trash heaped high against the passage walls, Karen couldn't help but think that he wasn't very good at his job. "Here we are," Ed said as they came abreast of an intricately defaced door. Strange runic symbols had been carved into every inch. "I can't say that I'm sad to see this creepy bastard in the ground. Sure, the clientele here leave much to be desired, what with all the druggies and whores, but this guy was a step above the rest. You know, I remember this one time." "Sir," interrupted Karen, shoving a $20 bill into the man's moist palm. "I don't mean to be rude, but this is really important, and I don't have time to talk right now." Big Ed put the money in one pocket with a self-deprecating grin and unlocked the door without another word. He was used to dealing with people who expected him to mind his own business while they tended to their own. The job didn't pay enough for him to care. "Thanks," Karen said as she walked inside Charles Lee Ray's apartment and shut the door behind her. Her first thought was that Chucky wasn't great at cleaning up after himself. Her second was that She was glad she was up to date on her tetanus shot. Beady eyes stared at her from the kitchen counters and stovetop. She heard Rat's small squeaks and the rustle of their fat tails dragging across dirty dishes. More eyes stared from the corners of the adjoining living room, watched from beneath the torn sofa and smashed television. Karen shivered. This was a dark place where bad things had been done. She felt the stain on the air like a physical presence. Better get a move on before the locals decide to take a bite out of you, she thought. There was a door to her left. She crossed the living room and tried it. The knob turned, but the door would only move an inch before it caught on the floor. Determined to not be balked now, she shoved with all of her strength and the door gave way before her, nearly spilling her to the grimy floor on the other side. She straightened up and looked around with a gasp, her slender hand going to her mouth. This must have been Chucky's bedroom. A soiled queen-size mattress lay on the floor in the middle of the room, surrounded by a tableau of images that told the story of Charles Lee Ray. The first wall showed a well-dressed white man with long brown hair and wild, crazy eyes, kneeling before a black man dressed in an elaborate Haitian costume. The black man had a very distinctive face and kind eyes. She looked to the next wall where a second mural showed the white man, now completely nude, holding his left arm out. He held a knife in his right and was using it to make 7 cuts across his forearm. Blood dripped from the wounds down onto a simplistic wooden effigy. The third image in the series was on the wall to her right. She looked and recoiled at what she saw. The naked white man was once again kneeling, now with the wooden effigy hanging from a leather strap around his neck. A huge being seemed to be coming from a dark, lightning-filled cloud. It towered over the man, its lower half that of a man, its upper half that of a hideous snake. Its forked tongue hung out over the man, and thick venom dripped down on him in a vile baptism. She turned a final time to take in the last wall and saw the white man laying dead at the feet of another man who now wore the effigy. Karen looked closer and saw that this new man had the same wild eyes and demented grin as the dead man. She glanced up and read the words that Charles Lee Ray had painted over the figures, finally understanding what it all meant. "Oh, thank you, mighty Damballa, for life after death." This is how he did it. This is how Chucky got into the doll. She stared around at the room in horror, new gulfs of terrible possibility opening before her, and a flyer resting on the end of the mattress caught her attention. She walked over on unsteady legs and lifted the paper by the corner, disgusted by the merest touch of anything in the apartment. A black man in ceremonial garb stared back at her from the picture, the words Dr. Death emblazoned across the top in white letters. She looked to the bottom and read, John Elsop Bishop, Papalois of Voodoo. Your wish is his command. There was an address below this in smaller font. Karen glanced from the flyer to the mural and nodded. The man in the flyer and the shaman on the wall were undoubtedly one and the same.
Karen.
She shrieked and spun around, hands raised to defend herself, and then relaxed when she realized that it was Mike standing in the doorway. "What are you doing here?" He stepped closer to her, looking around at the room in disgust.
After I talked to you last night, I decided to go to the station and get Ray's file. I learned a few things. His nickname was Chucky, and he spent a lot of time in the company of the man in the mural.
He reached into his jacket and produced a black and white mugshot of a middle-aged black man. Karen compared the mugshot to the flyer and the mural. It was the same man. She looked up into Mike's eyes, curious. "What is this? You're acting like you believe me now? Why the change of heart?" Mike held his bandaged hand out for her to see.
I met Chucky last night. He'd hidden in my car and tried to kill me. I shot him and he got up and ran away like it was nothing.
Something huge bloomed in Karen's chest. She wasn't alone anymore. She reached out and gripped Mike's lapels, pulling him closer. "This is great!" He stared into her eyes, smelled peppermint on her breath, and smirked.
An evil dog trying to carve me up like a Thanksgiving turkey is great. I know I didn't seem like I was on your side to begin with, but don't you think that's a little excessive?
It's great because we can prove Andy is telling the truth. We can get him out of the hospital. Mike grimaced, shaking his head.
No dice. People won't believe me anymore, they believe Andy. Hell, they'll probably pack both of us off to the hospital in straitjackets. I'm sorry, but we're on our own here.
Karen's face fell and she pulled away. He grieved the loss of her proximity, her warmth, especially that oppressive place. She looked down at the flyer still clutched in her hands and came back to life. She held it up and pointed to the address printed at the bottom, and then to the mural where Charles Lee Ray knelt before the benevolent-looking man. Maybe we aren't on our own after all. I think he might believe us. Mike looked up, considered, and then nodded.
It's worth a shot. Come on. I want you to follow me back to your apartment. We'll leave your car there and you can ride with me.
Karen frowned at him. Why? Mike shrugged, glad for the shadows in the room that hid his sudden blush.
Well, I'd just feel better if you were nearby. That way I could make sure you were all right. Besides, it's kind of exhausting tracking you down all over the city.
Karen smiled, charmed by his stumbling response. Did he really want her close by? Sure, she said. Let's go. Chapter 17. Dr. Death. The servitors gathered on the steps leading up to the Papaloy's home, singing and dancing to encourage the Iwa to come among them, for one of the spirits were sorely needed that morning. They could hear the child coughing and crying even over their songs. He was not a month old yet, born to desperately poor parents who could not afford Western medicine and did not trust in it regardless. They were in need, and the servitors knew that the Papaloy would provide. Inside, the Papaloy's voice rang out over the child's coughing and his young parents' soft sobs. Dr. Death, born John Elsop Bishop, hovered over the child, speaking words of power. He was dressed in the traditional garb and headdress of the Onguan, and he held an asun, a ritual rattle used in ceremonies, close to the child's chest. The light seemed to dim as his voice rose in volume, and his resuscitation grew faster, the syllables coming in rapid fire, staccato burst. The parents felt a breeze ruffle their hair despite the closed windows and doors. Something had come among them. The Papaloy's chant reached its crescendo, and then he subsided, seemed to shrink back into himself to become less than he had been the second before. He sighed, looking down on the now quiet child, with a fatherly smile on his dark face. "It is finished," he said, placing the asun into the mother's hands. "Take this with you, and make sure to keep it with him at night. Do this, and he will not cough any more." Fresh tears rolled down the woman's tired face as she stared up at him. She was like all the others gathered outside and that lived in the small community that had been swallowed by the larger world outside the neighborhood. They all needed something and expected him to provide. Sure, this time was a pleasure. John had always had a soft spot when it came to children, but he had his own needs too, and his energy was not limitless. He found there were times he had to bite his tongue to keep from shouting in the selfish servitors' faces when they came begging for a boon. Some wanted more money but didn't want to change their habits or get a job. Others wanted their receding hair to come back or their wrinkles to vanish. Some even asked to be magically more attractive to the opposite sex, though they were loath to stop overeating. It all came down to the same thing for most of them. Feed me. "Thank you, doctor," the little mother said as she held her sleeping baby boy to her chest. "Thank you so much." "You are very welcome," John replied as the father shoved a few wadded-up dollar bills into his hand. John could tell from the feel that it was far less than he would normally ask for his services, but he kept quiet and watched the family until they stepped out his front door into the waiting crowd outside. A cheer rose up a moment later, and then silence returned as the servitors moved on about their day, content that they had played a part of the healing with their dance and songs. John turned from the door and walked deeper into his home, away from the public area where he did his work. He stepped into his kitchen, removing his headdress and ceremonial costume. He hung each on a coat rack in the corner and deposited the money in a jar on top of the refrigerator. The smell of brewing tea filled his nostrils and he smiled. There was nothing better in the world than relaxing with a good book and a hot cup of mint tea. Perhaps he would crack open the new Tom Clancy novel he'd bought at the bookstore down the street last weekend. The Cardinal of the Kremlin. What an interesting title. "Hello, John." John nearly dropped his teacup, spinning towards the horribly familiar voice that suddenly filled the room. He didn't see his visitor until Chucky jumped up on the counter and performed a twirl as if he were the first ballet dancer to ascend from the depths of hell. "Hi," Chucky said, finishing his little pierrot with a bow. "What do you think? Did the gree-grees work?" John felt a deep cold in the pit of his soul as the teacup slipped from his numb fingers to shatter into so many porcelain splinters on the kitchen floor. This was wrong. This was perverse. "Of course," Chucky continued, "I wasn't close to another human being when I was dying, so I had to use the next best body available. Freaky, huh?" John nodded once, unable to speak yet, unable to tear his eyes away from the creature capering before him. "You know, when I came here to learn all that stuff about how to beat death, I thought maybe you were pulling my chain," Chucky said, shaking one stubby plastic finger in the air. "But not now. No, sir, not now. There's only one problem." John cleared his throat and finally found his voice. "What?" "This," Chucky replied, pointing to a small tear in his rainbow-colored shirt that was stained with crimson. "I didn't think anything could hurt me. After all, I'm in a doll's body, right? But last night I got shot. You know something? It hurt. It hurt like a son of a bitch. It even bled. Now why is that, John? You wouldn't think something like that would happen, would you?" John felt his head swimming, began to fear he might pass out. That would be very bad. Who knew what Chucky would do to him if he were to faint on him right now? John grimaced and bit down on his tongue. He tasted the coppery taste of his own blood, but was pleased to see the world coming back into sharper focus. "It is because you are turning human," John replied. "The more time you spend in that body, the more human you'll become. Lungs, heart, blood vessels, even human skin." Flint sparked in Chucky's eyes, and his face contorted into shapes the doll's face was never meant to make. John thought he'd never seen a more hideous sight. "No fucking way," spat Chucky. "You got me into this mess. Now you're gonna get me out." John shook his head, a steely resolution solidifying in his heart. "I can't do that, Chucky." Chucky frowned at his former teacher, the promise of imminent violence thick around him. "And why not?" "Because you are an abomination," John shouted, loathing and rage washing over his fear like a whelming wave. "You are an outrage against nature. You have perverted everything I have taught you and used it for evil. You have to be stopped." The phone was nearby. John stepped towards it and then froze when Chucky pulled a small effigy made of straw and wood from behind his back. The small figure's rudimentary face bore more than a passing resemblance to John. "You know," said Chucky as he waved the figure at John, "I thought something like this might happen. That's why I prepared for it. Recognize this? It's your own personal mojo, Doc. Made out of your hair, your clothes, even bathed in a little of your blood." Rage receded, overcome by stark terror the likes of which John Bishop had never felt before. His life was now quite literally in the hands of a madman. He took a step towards Chucky, his hand held out. "Give me that!" "Sure. How do you want it? Broken leg?" Chucky grabbed the effigy's fragile right leg and snapped it in half. John felt an explosion of agony as his leg bent in half above the knee. Felt the jagged bones rupture out of his skin. He screamed and collapsed to the floor. The world was pain, so much, too much for him to bear. He reached out his hand again, pleading for mercy from the merciless. Chucky jumped down from the counter and approached John, shaking his head in mock sadness that did not reach his gleeful eyes. "You shouldn't tell your customers where you hide shit like this, John. It'll get you into trouble every time. Now, how do I get out of this body?" "No," John groaned. "I won't tell you." "Oh, really?" Chucky asked, grabbing the effigy's left arm and bending it backwards. There was a horrendous crack, and John's arm bent backwards above the elbow. John's screams echoed off the ceiling and floors, redoubled in the man's ears. Chucky waited for the clamor to die down, a huge grin on his freckled face. "You know, there are so many more bones in the human body, John. Do you want me to break more?" "No!" John shouted. "No more!" "Then tell me what to do." "Please don't make me." "That's it," Chucky spat, reaching into his overalls and withdrawing an ornate knife decorated with red and silver filigree running along the sharp blade. He held the blade over the effigy. "My fucking patience has run out. Tell me what I want to know or die, John. It's your choice." John looked up at his diminutive tormentor and found that he had reached the limits of his nobility. He bowed his head in shame and began to speak. "Okay, I tell you. You have to transfer your soul out of the doll into the body of the first person you revealed your true self to." Chucky lowered the knife, laughing. "Okay. You mean the first person I let in on the fact I was really alive? I don't believe it. I just don't believe it." "The first person I let in on my little secret was a 6-year-old kid. I'm gonna be 6 years old again." A child, John thought. Oh, what have I done? Chucky leaned down near where the broken man lay, smiling at his handiwork. "Well, it's been fun, but I gotta go. I have a date with a 6-year-old boy, and you have a date with death." The knife rose high over the effigy, a guillotine ready to fall with head-chopping razor teeth. John tried to grab the mojo from Chucky, but he was far too slow. The blade descended, catching the glow of the light overhead, and pierced the effigy's chest. Ribs and flesh were cleaved in two, sending a large gout of blood spraying from the wound. Drops hit the light bulb and sizzled on the hot glass. "So long, John," Chucky said as he turned from the dying man and tossed the mojo onto the floor beside him. John watched him climb onto the counter and then duck out the open window above the sink before laying his head back on the cold floor and closing his eyes. Mike turned the corner, wheels squealing as he accelerated onto the straight street. Old red brick apartment buildings and wood frame houses with peeling paint and sagging steps lined the road on either side. Karen saw curious faces staring at them from porches and doorways. "Which one is Dr. Death's?" Karen asked.
"That one on the left."
he replied, pulling to a skidding stop in front of a weathered single-story house and shutting the car's ignition off. They ran from the vehicle and up the steps. Karen felt her heart pounding in her chest, felt fear. Something was wrong. Was it Andy? Had Chucky already managed to reach him? They came to John Bishop's door and paused, taking in the lit candles and gifts left on the porch by those desperate for his favor. Mike lifted his hand to knock and froze when he heard a faint moaning from the other side of the closed door. He gripped the knob and found it unlocked.
Hello?
He called as he pushed the door open.
Is anyone home?
I'm in here. Karen rushed past Mike, deeper into the house, pushed open a door and found John laying in a growing pool of his own blood. "Oh my God!" she gasped in shock at the sight of the man. His limbs were twisted into unnatural shapes, his body covered in crimson. She went to her knees beside him, taking a hand towel from the stove and pressing it against the gaping wound in his chest. She felt ribs shift beneath her hands, heard a wet sucking noise each time the man drew a ragged breath, saw blood bubbles forming at the edge of the wound. His lung is shredded, she thought. What did Chucky hit him with, a fire axe? John opened his eyes and followed Mike with them as he crossed the room to the phone and called for an ambulance. John looked back to Karen and shook his head slowly. "It's too late. Must save the boy. Chucky is headed there now. He must get his soul inside of the boy, just like he got it into the doll." "What do you mean?" Karen asked. "He must transfer his soul from the doll, or soon he will become trapped in that body. You must stop him before he can finish the chant. Kill him before he can say it." "How? Nothing stops him." John lifted his good hand and touched Karen with one finger in the center of her sternum, leaving a single bloody fingerprint. "The heart. His heart is almost human. It's the only way through the heart." He took a final breath, his eyes glazing over, staring into the middle space somewhere beyond Karen and all the pain. His hand fell away from her to land by his side.
The paramedics are on their way,
Mike said as he joined her at John's side. Karen reached out and gently closed the dead man's eyes. "They're gonna be too late."
Damn.
Mike muttered, helping her to her feet.
What now?
Karen walked to the sink and washed the blood from her hands and then took Mike by the elbow, pulling him towards the door. "We're going to the hospital. Chucky is going after Andy."
What? Why the hell would he do that?
"I'll explain it to you on the way." Chapter 18. Andy's Visitor. Andy ran down shadowed stone corridors, his sneakered feet splashing through vile puddles of filthy water that seeped from the moss-covered walls and dripped from the unseen ceiling that was lost in the darkness above. The only sounds were those of his labored breathing and the slap of his feet as he ran, and yet he knew he wasn't alone in that strange place. Something followed him through the midnight black tunnels. It watched him with alien eyes and unspeakable hunger. He could feel its mind touching his, could feel its hunger and desire to destroy him utterly. Whatever it was, it hated anything that belonged to the light. Innocent Andy was chief among its targets. He turned a corner and felt a rush of fetid air strike his sweaty face, smelled the decay of centuries and a bestial odor unlike anything he had ever encountered before. There was dim light ahead. Andy redoubled his speed, desperate to escape the tunnel and the monster that lived there. He came to an opening and stumbled to a stop, staring. The space was an immense circle surrounded by towering walls. There were openings all the way around, more tunnels like the one Andy fled through. "It's like a maze," he thought, "and I found the middle. This is bad. This is where it lives." A large raised dais dominated the center of the space, its stone surface made of rocks so black they seemed to swallow the dim light that filtered down from the starless sky overhead. Andy felt his feet begin to move of their own accord and tried to resist the pull. He did not want to go near the platform, found he feared it more than the unseen thing that had chased him this far. It wanted me to come here. This is where it eats. Maybe so, but that didn't matter. Andy couldn't stop himself from walking forward any more than he could stop the sun from rising. Details came into focus as he drew closer. He saw pictures carved into the stone that told a story of pain and terror, every panel a new breed of violence. He reached the steps, started up, and felt his heart begin to shriek at what he saw. His mother and Mike lay on a large altar, their clothes removed and their abdomens slit open from pelvis to sternum. Wet coils of intestine were splayed out around them, and there was so much blood, yet their eyes were open and hatefully aware. They screamed and screamed. Chucky stood over them, a butcher's knife clutched in his plastic, gory hands. "Andy, do you like what I've done with the place?" Chucky asked, cackling madly. Andy shook his head back and forth, telling himself that it was just a dream, only a bad dream. Then something moved above Chucky, and Andy looked up at a huge statue that loomed over the screaming adults and laughing doll. It was part human, part snake, and completely awful. The statue's eyes glowed crimson. A cloud roiled over above it all, dark and ominous. It moved strangely, not as if moved by the wind, but by something vile that slithered and crawled within. Lightning flashed down, striking the statue, making it glow bright as day. A voice spoke then, deep as the heart of a mountain, crackling with menace and desire. "Boy!" It growled. Andy felt his mind wanting to tear away from its moorings, wanting to run from the terror before it had him screaming into insanity. Andy closed his eyes, shouting no over and over again. Andy fell from the bed in a tangle of blanket and hit the tile floor on his side. He sat up and looked around, his heart hammering in his little chest. He wasn't home, but the hospital was still better than the place he'd seen in his nightmare. He got to his feet, rubbing his sore shoulder, and looked to the locked room door. Would Chucky come at him from there? Would he be able to sneak past the watchful orderlies to bring painful, piercing death? A strange scraping sound drifted to him through the open window. Andy turned that direction, a sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach. It wasn't possible. Andy's room was on the 4th floor of the hospital. Chucky couldn't possibly climb the side of the building, could he? Andy imagined the evil good guy doll scaling the sheer surface of the hospital like some demented spider and shuddered. The noise came again, so like the sound Andy's sneakers made when he slid to a stop on wet sidewalks on the playground at his school. He crossed the small room with trepidation and stuck his head between the metal security bars to look down. Chucky was there, not crawling creepily up the wall like a spider, but shimmying up a drain pipe bolted to the side of the building, a foot from the small ledge outside the window. Chucky saw Andy peering down at him and smiled with wicked mirth. "Hiya, Andy," he called out. "Hold on a second. I'll be right there." A pit seemed to open in the floor beneath Andy's feet, threatening to swallow him whole. He looked around the room in terror. There was nowhere to run and nowhere to hide from the demon, drawing inexorably nearer every second. He had to get help before it was too late. He ran and grabbed a chair from the desk and dragged it in front of the locked door. He clambered up and stared wide-eyed out into the corridor through the postcard-sized window in the top of the door. "Help me!" he cried, his voice shrill with panic. "He's coming to kill me!" He was answered by a chorus of raised voices from the rooms around him, each echoing his pleas. "Help me! He's coming to kill me too! He's almost here! He's in the room with me!" Laughter followed, filling the corridor with hyena giggles. An orderly walked by and didn't even acknowledge the clamor. He was a veteran of the children's wing and had heard this and many other outbursts over the years. Every kid had their nightmare in that place, and it wasn't his job to comfort or counsel. He left that to the doctors. Andy jumped down from the chair and sprinted over to the window. He looked down and screamed. Chucky was only 5 feet away. "Hold on, Andy. Just you hold on." "What do I do now?" Andy thought. His eyes fell on the little desk by the bed, and a light bulb went off in his head. He crossed to the desk and dragged it across the room, upending it in front of the window. It wasn't quite tall enough to cover the whole opening, but it would have to do. Andy grabbed the chair and pushed it against the desk for a little extra weight, and then he sat against the barrier. A second later, he heard tiny footsteps on the ledge outside and felt pressure from the other side as Chucky tried to force his way in. "Do you think a table will stop me, boy? No way! No fucking way!" More pressure, and then Chucky's arm slipped through the side of the window and flailed around, seeking Andy in vain. Finally, Chucky gave another curse and withdrew his arm. "You're gonna be smart about it, are ya?" Chucky said, kicking the desk. "Well, not smart enough. You're mine, you little shit." Andy heard the squeak of Chucky's shoes as he walked along the ledge towards another window. He was going to find another way in. Andy leapt for the door and began to scream as loud as he could. A moment later, a familiar pair of eyes appeared at the viewport. "He's here, Dr. Ardmore!" Andy shouted, jumping up and down, his body telling him he must run even though there was nowhere to go. "Chucky's here!" Ardmore surveyed the state of the room behind the little boy, frowning disapprovingly. "I don't see anybody." "I'm telling you, he's here! Chucky's here and he's gonna kill me!" Ardmore reached through the small window and patted Andy's outstretched hand reassuringly. "Don't you worry, son. I'm going to get something and I'll be right back." The man vanished from the door and Andy began to sob. He turned his back to the door and slid slowly down to sit on the floor, his eyes on the barricaded window. Chucky slid between the window bars of the orderly's break room and hopped to the floor as silent and lithe as a tomcat. He glanced down at his aching fingers and saw small cuts, seeping drops of blood that he got from the drainpipe's jagged edges. The image of an hourglass appeared in his mind, the sand in the top globe almost gone. "God damn it, I'm running out of time." A fat orderly sat in a threadbare lounge chair reading a newspaper, his keyring left forgotten on the table behind him. Chucky crept across and paused a foot behind the oblivious man. How easy it would be to open the slob's throat. That would be a real blast, but There were more important things to take care of. The fun would come later. He took the keys and walked out into the corridor. The coast was mostly clear, save for a small girl dressed in a hospital gown sitting against the hallway wall. She was muttering to herself and rocking back and forth, striking the back of her head against the wall over and over again. Chucky looked around again, heard the heavy tread of an orderly coming near. He couldn't just walk down the hall to the brat's room. He needed help. "She will do," he thought, walking over to stand in front of her. He waited until she raised her eyes to look at him and then threw her a little wave, playing the part of good guy to the hilt. "Hi, my name's Chucky. What's your name?" "Mona," she whispered. "It's so great to meet you, Mona. Tell me, would you like to take me for a walk?" The little girl nodded and Chucky jumped into her arms. "That's great. Listen, I want to go see my old friend Andy. His room is down the hallway. Can you take me there, Mona?" Mona nodded again and stood up, starting down the corridor. An orderly noticed her with the doll as she passed and smiled at her. "Hi, Mona," he said. "Where are you off to?" She nodded to the red-headed doll held in her arms, not quite meeting the orderly's gaze. "He wants to go for a walk." "That's nice," said the orderly, dismissing the crazy little girl as he went about his duties. Mona walked on and came to a stop in front of Andy's room. Chucky reached out from his position against her chest and unlocked the door with one of the stolen keys. "Thanks a ton, Mona," he said as he jumped down from her arms and pushed the door open. "You really did me a solid." Mona just stared after him in silence as he stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. He scanned the room for his prey and saw a huddled mass hiding beneath the covers on the bed. "So you want to play hide and seek, do you?" He chuckled, tossing the keys to the side and pulling the red and silver ritual knife from his overalls. Andy made no response, but that was fine. Let him keep quiet. He was about to find there was no more time for words, especially after Chucky had finished the ritual and swapped bodies with him. He was sure Andy would have a lot to say when Chucky tossed the doll from the window. Oh, how Andy would scream all the way down until his new doll body was crushed on the asphalt below. Chucky climbed up on the bed and took the blankets in his free hand. He raised the knife, ready to threaten and cut if that's what it took to make the boy compliant. "Andy, I've got you now." He yanked the covers back and froze. There was no Andy beneath the sheets, just a bundle of clothes and a pillow. "What? Where are you, you little—" Noise from under him, and Chucky turned to see Andy crawl from beneath the bed and sprint through the unlocked door into the corridor with the orderly's keyring in his hands. "No!" Chucky yelled, jumping down from the bed to pursue the boy. Andy ran faster than he'd ever run before, his steps echoing along the corridor. Wide eyes stared from viewports as he passed, their owners hooting and shouting, lost in their own nightmares. He skidded to a stop beside a door labeled stairs and started trying different keys. The first and second were too big for the keyhole, the third too small. He raised the fourth and paused when someone called his name from down the hall. He glanced up to see Dr. Ardmore standing near the elevator with a hypodermic needle in his hand. "Orderly!" he shouted. "The Barclay boy has escaped his room! Stop him!" There was no time left. It would be the fourth key or nothing. He jammed the key forward and was filled with elation when it rammed to the hilt in the lock and turned easily. "No, Andy, wait!" The doctor was the really crazy person if he thought that Andy was going to stop. Andy ran through the door into the stairwell and fled down. If only he could reach the bottom floor and get away. He could find home from there. He would lock the door and hide from Chucky until Mommy found him. Then he would be safe again. But it wasn't meant to be. Doors slammed open from below and above him. Shouted voices filled the stairwell. They were coming, and they would lock him back up in his room. He was as good as dead if they did that. There was a door on the landing beside him. He tried it, found it unlocked, and hurtled through it into a deserted corridor, the twin of the one on the children's ward above. He turned left and ran, hearing faint footsteps behind him. He looked back over his shoulder and thought he caught a glimpse of red hair ducking behind a gurney. He heard the rattle of the stairwell door as the hospital staff reached it and ducked through a door on his right. The room was flooded with darkness, lit only by a single dim security light overhead. He couldn't tell what kind of room this was, but he could make out a gurney in the center. He went to his knees and crawled beneath it, the overhanging sheets hiding him. A moment later, he heard thunderous footsteps as the doctor and orderlies ran by the room and kept moving further down the hall. Andy waited until their noise was gone and then climbed back out from beneath the gurney, moving towards the door. He had to keep going. He had to find a way out of the hospital before Chucky came calling again. Brilliant lights came to life, blinding Andy, and he spun around desperately trying to see. "Going somewhere?" asked a dreadfully familiar voice from behind him. Andy turned and looked up to a balcony that stretched the length of the room and saw Chucky in all his corrupt glory. The doll threw him a wave and then leapt from the balcony down to the floor. He struck with a soft thump, knocking a tray of surgical instruments over, before rolling away and disappearing. Andy picked up a scalpel from the spilled tools and began to back towards the door to the corridor, glancing around frantically for any sign of movement. "Thought you were gonna get away from me, did you?" Chucky asked, his voice soft but emphatic. "There's no getting away from me. Not now. Not ever." Andy was almost to the door. Surely Chucky would attack before he reached it. Andy tensed his body ready to fight and screamed when the door opened behind him and a hand clamped down on the back of his neck. "Easy, Andy," Dr. Ardmore said as he lifted Andy into his arms and pulled the scalpel out of his little hands. "You don't need that anymore." "But I do!" Andy shouted, trying to break the doctor's grasp as Ardmore carried him to the gurney in the center of the room and set him down. "Chucky is in the room. He's trying to kill me." "Sure he is," Ardmore patronized. He pulled the hypodermic needle from his pocket and began to roll Andy's sleeve up. "Please listen to me. He'll kill you too." Ardmore ignored him. He raised the needle. "This will only hurt for a second. Then you'll feel much better." "No!" Suddenly, the doctor's whole body went rigid, and he collapsed to the floor with a shout of pain. Andy looked and saw the scalpel buried in Ardmore's thigh, saw the man's gray slacks turning crimson as the blood ran down his leg. "What's up, Doc?" Chucky asked as he emerged from his hiding place behind a ventilator. "How's it hanging?" Ardmore stared up at the good guy doll, his mouth agape. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. "No, no, no, you aren't real." "Oh, yes, yes, yes," Chucky said as he stepped forward and slipped a strange apparatus down over the doctor's head. "Tell me something, Doc. Is this what you used to make your crazy patients better? They're called shock treatments, right?" Ardmore tried to pull the device from his head, and Chucky lashed out with the butt of a heavy bone saw, shattering the man's hand. "No, sir," Chucky said, over Ardmore's cries of pain. "No touchy." He climbed up onto a stool near a machine attached to the headpiece by a forest of wires and began to peruse the buttons and knobs. "They used shock treatments on me once, but I don't think they worked. Doc, do you think they'll work on you?" Ardmore's eyes grew wide as he realized what Chucky was about to do. He reached up with his unbroken hand to remove the headset, but he was too late. Chucky twisted a dial and electricity began to flow through Ardmore's body. Andy saw the man galvanized and jumped down from the table, charging towards Chucky. "Stop it!" Chucky saw him coming and picked up a large metal tray from beside the machine and swung it with all of his might. The tray caught Andy squarely in the face and sent him tumbling backwards. Andy hit the floor dazed. "How do you feel there, Doc?" Chucky asked, turning back to Ardmore, who was still spasming under the current. "Are you cured yet?" "Nah, you're not cured. You need more." Chucky grabbed a lever and shoved it all the way up, turning the voltage to the maximum setting. Ardmore arched his back as if he were trying to bend in half. Smoke began to rise from his charring skin. Blood began to seep from his ears, eyes, and nostrils. There were 2 mushy pops as his eyeballs ruptured, leaking vitreous fluid onto Ardmore's cooking cheeks. "Now you're better, Doc." Chucky cackled. He was so involved in his sick game that he didn't notice when Andy climbed to his feet and stealthily left the room. Chapter 19. One Step Behind. The elevator doors opened onto pandemonium. A wave of sound from the patients struck them like a solid wall, their shouts and laughter filling the air. Mike grimaced and glanced over to where Karen stood, shaking beside him. What must she be feeling at that moment, knowing that her only child was forced to live in a place like that? Would she blame him? She saw him watching her and nodded that she was all right. Mike nodded back and led her past forensic technicians and uniformed police officers to where his partner, Jack Santos, leaned against one wall waiting for them. The detective perked up when he saw them approaching. "Hey, Mike," Jack said. "Where you been all morning? I've been trying to get a hold of you."
"I've been busy,"
Mike said tensely, unaccustomed to being questioned by a lower-ranking officer, even if they were friends.
"What happened here?"
Jack glanced pointedly at Karen. Excuse me, ma'am." He took Mike by the elbow and led him a few feet further down the hallway where they could talk without being overheard. Mike threw an apologetic look back to Karen and saw that she was kneeling down to speak to one of the patients, a pale little girl dressed in a white hospital gown. Mike looked back to Jack, waiting. Jack cleared his throat and then whispered, "Her kid killed Dr. Ardmore." Mike raised his eyebrows.
"You've got to be kidding."
Jack shook his head. "The kid fried the doc to a crisp with an electronic shock therapy machine. Christ, I've never seen a mess like that before. I don't think I'll ever eat barbecue again." Mike gripped Jack's shoulder hard, quieting the man, and asked,
"What about the kid? Where is he?"
He escaped in the confusion. We've got security footage of him using a set of keys stolen from an orderly to unlock a service entrance downstairs. You know what I think? I bet Mommy Dearest knows where he is." Mommy Dearest? Mike thought, his anger flaring like a stoked flame. He didn't like Jack's tone or his insinuation about Karen and had to bite back a scathing retort. God, she's really gotten to me.
"What about Chucky?"
Mike asked.
"Have you seen him around?"
Jack furrowed his eyebrows in confusion. Who?
"The boy's doll, the same one we had at the station house. Have you seen him around?"
No, of course not. What the hell are you going on about, Mike? What would the doll be doing here? Mike turned away and walked down the hall, ignoring his partner's questions. There was no time to explain and no point. The pragmatic detective would never believe him. He reached Karen just as she was finishing her conversation with the girl.
They think Andy killed Dr. Ardmore,
he said, taking her hand to help her to her feet. I know, she said, nodding her head in the direction of Mona. This little girl said Chucky was here. He spoke to her. He was looking for Andy.
Shit,
Mike muttered. He wanted to lash out, to pound the bastard that was responsible for all their trouble into dust.
Do you have an idea where Andy might be headed?
He'll go home. That's where I've always told him to go when he's in trouble.
Does he have a key?
Sure, she said. There's a spare key hidden beneath a potted plant that sits in the hall outside the door. Mike cursed again.
I bet your home will be the first place Chucky checks for Andy too. Come on, we haven't got much time.
They turned back towards the elevators and jogged down the corridor, ignoring the curious gazes of the officers and technicians who stared as they flew by. Hey, Mike, Jack shouted from behind them. Where are you going? Mike didn't have time to answer. They caught the elevator as the doors were beginning to close, cutting off the detective's raised voice. Karen hit the button for the ground floor as Mike drew his service revolver and opened the cylinder to make sure the gun was fully loaded. Would it be enough to stop Chucky this time? John Bishop said the only way was to shoot Chucky through the heart. Mike prayed that his aim was true and the dead man was right. Okay, Slashaholics, this has been chapters 15, 16, 17, 18, and 19 of Child's Play, the novelization by Jeremy Terry. Once again, loving this book. Such a great job, Jeremy. Cannot wait to see what you're going to do with Jason Goes to Hell. It's going to be great. As far as the stuff we covered tonight, you know, I love the fact that even at 6 years old, Andy knows when he's being bullshitted and when somebody's disingenuine like that doctor. I can't imagine the terror of knowing that the doll had threatened him. If you tell anybody, I'll kill you. So that's all Andy knows, is that he had to tell. Now he's dead. You know, Chucky's going to find him. The adults aren't going to help him. They're not going to listen to him, etc., etc. Very scary stuff. Great job getting that across in the book, Jeremy. Great job, again, by Shawn Campbell and GarbagePail Queen doing Andy and Mike's voices. Loving that. If anybody listening is a patron or wants to become a patron of the $10 tier or higher and you want to voice a character in the book, in future books, you can do so anytime you want to. All you got to do is reach out and let me know that you're a $10 patron or higher and you want to voice a character, and I'll set it up for you. Also, right now, if you're a $10 patron or higher or become one by February 1st, or if you make a $10 donation to the channel through PayPal, Cash App, or getting a Cameo, you can actually get entered into a drawing where the winner will get a death scene in the Jason Goes to Hell novelization by Jeremy Terry. Not only will you get a death scene as yourself, you'll get to pick how Jason does it within reason. So that's going to be a lot of fun. If you want to do that, like I said, look at the description or pinned comment below on how to donate or become a patron. Then we got into chapter 16 tonight. You know, the stuff with Mike and Karen, that's all great. I love that Karen got to Charles Lee Ray's house and we got to see, you know, a little more than the movie would show into Charles Lee Ray's, I don't know what you'd call it, into his psyche a little bit. He's got these murals on his wall, the like half man, half snake stuff, the Damballa stuff. Digging the hell out of this stuff, man. Jeremy, you're really knocking it out of the park. Great visualization there with the words. Reading this has been a lot of fun, not just narrating it, but getting to read it. This movie has always deserved a novelization, and this one is fan-fucking-tastic. The scene we got between John and Chucky was brutal, and I thought it was even more brutal, more revealing than the movie did it justice. I think Jeremy did it so much better, a lot more detail, you know, just how joyful and humorous it was to Chucky, that he was going to be a 6-year-old again, you know. And I've always wondered, if Chucky, I guess the TV show has kind of answered this. Chucky becomes Andy. Andy would go into the doll, right? That would be an interesting dynamic there. But anyways, the fact that John, who does this voodoo stuff, and I'm sure I pronounced some words wrong during that chapter. If I did, I apologize. It was fun playing a guy that's dying. It was fun being Chucky tonight, especially with how humorous it was to him, and then how pissed he was. But John's supposed to be this like voodoo, controller of the Gree-Grees and everything, and he reached his breaking point of nobility. I loved that line. I think we all have that. We just we got to be pushed to that limit, and it's like, okay, fuck it, here you go. But yeah, getting my femur shattered might do it before even getting my arm broken. Brutal stuff. Loved when Karen and Mike got there. And I love that Karen's not alone on this. Mike knows what's going on after the last narration I put out with Chucky attacking him at the car. I really enjoyed the intensity and fear that was portrayed on the page there in the hospital, with Andy knowing that Chucky's coming. Whenever he sees him climbing up the wall and this little 6-year-old has to put it together in his head, a game plan, I love the little scene with Mona that we got, the little girl that gave Chucky, a little quick trip to Andy's room. I love that later on Mona was the one that explained that to Karen. Just really enjoying and loving all the little extra things that Jeremy's throwing into this book, into this story. He did an amazing job. Lots of hard work, I can tell, and it is appreciated. Like I said, just great visualizations here. The whole shock treatment scene was gory as hell, insane, painful to even think about. But, just the intensity of Andy escaping the room after tricking Chucky, getting that, knowing that he only had time to try that last key, and if it didn't work, it was over. But he got it in there. Getting hit by Chucky by that pan, oh my God, bam. Mike actually knowing that Chucky's real, but his partner Jax, calling Karen crazy and shit like that. Just to see that Mike has come full circle here. He's actually getting upset. He really cares for Karen and Andy. Cannot wait to put out the conclusion of this book in the next narration. Only 2 chapters left. It's coming, folks. And I hope you're going to enjoy it as much as I know I will. Things are getting serious for Chucky. He knows that he's mortal. He can die if he doesn't get a new body. So, cannot wait to dive back into this one. It's going to be very soon. Hope you all enjoyed it. Let me know what you thought of tonight's chapters in the comments below. And I love hearing from you. And I'll see you very soon. Until then, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying thanks for listening. Be excellent to each other. Remember, the sun never sets on those who ride into it. And you can't keep a good guy down.
I can't think of a thing to say. Fuck it.